In February 2022, Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine as missiles struck cities thousands of kilometers apart, and the world struggled to understand what it was witnessing. Was this a sudden invasion or the final act of a much longer story? Why would Europe's largest country risk everything on a war that seemed impossible to contain? And what exactly was Ukraine fighting for? Survival, sovereignty, or something even larger? The answers were buried in decades of history, fear, ambition, and miscalculation. In this video, I'm going to discuss all of this, how it began, what happened, and how it changed the world. So without any delay, let's start. To understand why this war began, you have to go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. When the USSR dissolved, it didn't just redraw borders, it shattered identities, power structures, and assumptions that had defined Eastern Europe for generations. Ukraine emerged as an independent state almost overnight, inheriting territory, industries, and even nuclear weapons, but without the political traditions or security guarantees that older nations had developed over centuries. For many Ukrainians, independence was a long-awaited dream. For many in Moscow, it felt like a historical rupture that had gone too far. Russia in the 1990s was weak, economically broken, and politically unstable. Its leadership was consumed by internal survival rather than external influence. During this period, former Soviet states moved quickly to define their own futures. Some gravitated toward Western institutions like the European Union and NATO, seeking stability, investment, and security. From their perspective, this was not an act of hostility toward Russia, but an escape from a past associated with repression and stagnation. From Moscow's perspective, it looked very different. As NATO expanded eastward, absorbing countries that had once been firmly inside the Soviet sphere, Russian leaders grew increasingly uneasy. They argued that assurances had been given at the end of the Cold War that NATO would not move closer to Russia's borders. Whether these assurances were formal or informal remains debated, but the perception inside Russia hardened. Each expansion was seen not as defensive, but as encroachment. Ukraine, large, strategically located, and culturally intertwined with Russia, became the most sensitive of all. For Russia, Ukraine was never just another neighbor. It occupied a central place in Russian history, identity, and strategic thinking. Kyiv was often described as the cradle of Russian civilization. Economically, Ukraine was a vital transit route for energy exports to Europe. Militarily, its geography mattered. A Ukraine aligned with the West would bring NATO's influence uncomfortably close to Russia's heartland. A Ukraine aligned with Moscow would preserve a buffer that Russian leaders had relied on for centuries. Ukraine, meanwhile, was deeply divided over its own direction. Its politics oscillated between leaders who favored closer ties with Russia and those who pushed for integration with Europe. This internal tug-of-war reflected regional, linguistic, and economic differences within the country. Western Ukraine leaned toward Europe, while eastern regions maintained closer ties to Russia. These divisions were real, but they did not mean Ukraine was destined to fragment. Instead, they made the country politically fragile, vulnerable to pressure from both sides. The turning point came in 2014, when Ukraine's president abandoned a planned agreement with the European Union under pressure from Moscow. Mass protests erupted in Kyiv. What began as a pro-European movement quickly became a broader uprising against corruption and authoritarianism. The government collapsed, and a new leadership emerged with a clear Western orientation. In Moscow, this was not seen as a popular revolution, but as a Western-backed coup. Trust between Russia and Ukraine collapsed almost entirely. Russia responded swiftly. Crimea was annexed after a rushed referendum that the international community rejected as illegitimate. Soon after, fighting broke out in eastern Ukraine, where Russian-backed separatists declared breakaway republics. Moscow denied direct involvement, but weapons, fighters, and support flowed across the border. The war in Donbas simmered for years, killing thousands while remaining largely frozen in global attention. To many outsiders, it looked like a localized conflict. To Ukraine, it was a warning. To Russia, it was leverage. Diplomatic agreements attempted to stop the fighting, but they never addressed the deeper problem. Ukraine wanted sovereignty and security. Russia wanted influence and guarantees that Ukraine would never join NATO. Neither side trusted the other to compromise honestly. Meanwhile, Ukraine's identity continued to evolve. The conflict pushed more Ukrainians toward a shared sense of nationhood, one increasingly defined in opposition to Russian control rather than dependence on it. By the late 2010s, the situation had hardened. Ukraine deepened cooperation with Western countries, receiving military training, equipment, and political support. NATO membership remained distant, but the direction was clear. Russia, under Vladimir Putin, increasingly framed the issue in existential terms. Ukraine was not just a neighbor choosing a different path, it was portrayed as a threat, manipulated by hostile powers, erasing historical ties, and undermining Russia's security. This narrative mattered. Inside Russia, it shaped public opinion and justified increasingly aggressive rhetoric. The Kremlin argued that it was being surrounded, that its warnings had been ignored, and that decisive action was now unavoidable. Western leaders dismissed these claims as exaggerated or manipulative, pointing out that NATO was defensive and Ukraine posed no direct threat. Both sides were speaking past each other, trapped in their own assumptions. In the months leading up to 2022, Russian forces began massing near Ukraine's borders. Officially, they were conducting exercises. Privately, intelligence agencies warned of an imminent invasion. Many analysts remained skeptical. A full-scale war in Europe seemed irrational, economically disastrous, and politically risky. Russia had much to lose. Ukraine, though improving its defenses, was still militarily weaker. The assumption was that bluff, pressure, and limited escalation were the real goals. Those assumptions collapsed when the invasion began. Russia did not limit itself to eastern Ukraine. It attacked from multiple directions, targeting Kyiv, Kharkiv, and other major cities. The scale and ambition of the operation revealed that this was not about minor concessions or frozen conflicts. It was about reshaping Ukraine's future entirely. Russian leadership appeared to believe that the Ukrainian state would collapse quickly, that resistance would be limited, and that the West would respond with words rather than action. These expectations would soon collide with reality. Ukraine did not fall apart. Its leadership stayed. Its population resisted. Western countries imposed sweeping sanctions and began supplying weapons on an unprecedented scale. What was intended as a rapid operation turned into a grinding war. And as the fighting intensified, it became clear that this conflict was no longer just about Ukraine and Russia. It was about the rules of the international system itself, about whether borders could still be changed by force, about whether smaller states had the right to choose their alliances without punishment, about whether military power could override economic interdependence in a globalized world. The Russia-Ukraine war had begun, but its stakes extended far beyond the battlefield, touching the foundations of global order in ways that would only become clearer as the war dragged on. As the first weeks of the invasion unfolded, the gap between Russia's expectations and the reality on the ground became impossible to ignore. The Russian military had entered Ukraine with a plan that appeared to rely on speed, shock, and the assumption of limited resistance. Columns of armored vehicles advanced along major roads, airborne units attempted to seize key airports, and missiles struck military infrastructure deep inside the country. The goal seemed clear: decapitate Ukraine's leadership, paralyze its command structure, and force a rapid political collapse. Instead, almost everything that could go wrong did. Ukrainian forces did not crumble. They adapted quickly, using smaller, mobile units armed with modern anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons supplied by Western partners. Ambushes turned Russian convoys into targets. Supply lines stretched thin across hostile territory, exposing logistical weaknesses that had been underestimated. Vehicles ran out of fuel, communication systems failed, coordination between units broke down. The image of a modern, unstoppable Russian army began to fracture. The attempted assault on Kyiv became symbolic of this miscalculation. Russian troops reached the outskirts of the capital, but they were unable to secure it. Ukrainian defenses held, supported by intelligence, local knowledge, and a population that largely rejected the idea of surrender. President Volodymyr Zelensky's decision to remain in Kyiv, broadcasting messages from the city, became a powerful symbol of defiance. What Russia had expected to be a swift psychological victory turned into a rallying point for Ukrainian resistance. At the same time, Russian firepower caused immense destruction. Artillery and airstrikes hit residential areas, infrastructure, and hospitals. Cities like Mariupol were gradually encircled and devastated. Civilian casualties mounted, and millions of Ukrainians fled their homes, creating one of Europe's largest refugee crises since World War II. The humanitarian dimension of the war reshaped global perception. This was no longer an abstract geopolitical dispute. It was a human catastrophe unfolding in real time. Western responses escalated rapidly. Economic sanctions targeted Russia's financial system, energy exports, and key individuals. Assets were frozen, trade restricted, and Russia's integration into the global economy was sharply reduced. At the same time, military aid flowed into Ukraine. Anti-tank missiles, air defense systems, artillery, drones, and intelligence support transformed Ukraine's ability to fight. While NATO avoided direct involvement, its role as a supplier and coordinator became central. This external support changed the war's trajectory. Ukraine was no longer fighting alone. The conflict evolved into a proxy struggle between Russia and the West, even if neither side wanted to use that term openly. For Moscow, this reinforced the narrative that the war was not really about Ukraine, but about resisting Western dominance. For Western governments, supporting Ukraine became a test of credibility, values, and deterrence. As Russia adjusted its strategy, the war entered a new phase. Failing to capture Kyiv, Russian forces withdrew from northern Ukraine and concentrated on the east and south. The focus shifted to the Donbas region, where Russia sought to use its advantage in artillery and manpower to grind down Ukrainian defenses. Battles became slower, more destructive, and reminiscent of industrial-era warfare. Towns were reduced to rubble in prolonged engagements that gained little ground at enormous cost. Ukraine, meanwhile, continued to adapt. It combined defensive resilience with selective counteroffensives, exploiting Russian weaknesses where possible. Western intelligence and precision weapons allowed Ukrainian forces to strike supply depots, command centers, and bridges far beyond the front lines. The war became one of attrition, but not in the way Russia had anticipated. Economic pressure, battlefield losses, and international isolation began to weigh heavily on Moscow. Inside Russia, the war triggered its own transformations. Independent media outlets were shut down or silenced. Dissent was criminalized. The state tightened control over information, presenting the conflict as a defensive operation against Western aggression. Casualties were downplayed and setbacks minimized. Yet beneath the surface, unease grew. Families received notices of fallen soldiers. Sanctions affected daily life. The promise of a quick, decisive victory had clearly failed. In Ukraine, the war reshaped national identity with remarkable speed. Linguistic and regional differences that had once divided the country became less significant than the shared experience of resistance. Even in areas with historically strong ties to Russia, attitudes shifted as the reality of invasion set in. The war hardened Ukraine's resolve to define itself as an independent nation, separate from Russian influence. This transformation was one of the invasion's most profound and irreversible consequences. Diplomatic efforts to end the conflict struggled to gain traction. Early talks produced little beyond temporary humanitarian corridors. Each side believed time was on its side. Russia hoped to exhaust Ukraine and outlast Western support. Ukraine believed continued resistance would weaken Russia economically and militarily. This stalemate mentality prolonged the war, making compromise politically dangerous for leaders on both sides. As months passed, the conflict became increasingly global in its impact. Energy prices surged as sanctions disrupted Russian exports. Food shortages threatened vulnerable regions due to Ukraine's role as a major grain producer. Inflation spread worldwide. The war exposed how interconnected the global economy had become and how a regional conflict could trigger cascading effects far beyond its borders. What had begun as a calculated gamble by Russia turned into a prolonged confrontation with unpredictable consequences. The battlefield extended beyond trenches and cities to financial markets, diplomatic forums, and information networks. The Russia-Ukraine war was no longer just about territory. It had become a contest over endurance, legitimacy, and the future shape of international power. And as the fighting dragged on, a deeper question emerged. Even if one side gained ground or forced concessions, what kind of peace could follow a war that had already destroyed trust so completely? As the war moved into its second year, it became clear that neither side could achieve a decisive victory quickly. What emerged instead was a grinding conflict defined by attrition, adaptation, and escalation. The front lines hardened, stretching across eastern and southern Ukraine, marked by trenches, minefields, and heavily fortified positions. This phase of the war resembled a hybrid of 21st century technology and 20th century brutality, where drones and satellites coexisted with artillery duels and infantry assaults. One of the defining features of this stage was the battle for territory in eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Russia framed these areas as the core objective of its special military operation, claiming to defend Russian-speaking populations and consolidate control over the Donbas. Ukraine, on the other hand, saw these regions as sovereign territory whose loss would set a dangerous precedent. Every village, every ruined town became symbolically and strategically important. Artillery dominated the battlefield. Russia relied heavily on massed firepower, firing thousands of shells daily to wear down Ukrainian defenses. This approach reflected both Russia's military doctrine and its industrial capacity, but it came at a high cost. Ammunition stockpiles were depleted at alarming rates, forcing Russia to seek supplies from abroad and ramp up domestic production. Ukraine, with fewer guns and shells, focused on precision. Western-supplied systems like HIMARS allowed Ukrainian forces to strike high-value targets, disrupting Russian logistics and command structures. Technology increasingly shaped the war's dynamics. Drones became ubiquitous, used for reconnaissance, targeting, and direct attacks. Commercial quadcopters were modified into lethal weapons, while sophisticated military drones extended surveillance deep behind enemy lines. Electronic warfare grew more intense, with both sides attempting to jam communications and navigation systems. Cyber operations and information warfare continued alongside physical combat, blurring the boundaries between civilian and military domains. The human cost of this prolonged fighting was staggering. Casualties mounted on both sides, though exact numbers remained contested and politically sensitive. Ukrainian cities and towns near the front lines were systematically damaged or destroyed. Infrastructure, power plants, water systems, transportation networks became frequent targets, particularly during winter when strikes on energy facilities aimed to break civilian morale. millions of Ukrainians lived with rolling blackouts, displacement, and constant uncertainty. Despite these hardships, Ukrainian resistance did not collapse. Instead, the war accelerated Ukraine's integration with the West. Military cooperation deepened, training programs expanded, intelligence sharing became routine. Politically, Ukraine advanced its bid for closer ties with the European Union and NATO, framing its struggle as part of a broader defense of democratic values. For many Western governments, supporting Ukraine was no longer just about countering Russia, but about upholding the post-Cold War international order. Russia, meanwhile, recalibrated its own approach. Faced with manpower shortages, the Kremlin announced partial mobilization, calling up hundreds of thousands of reservists. This move marked a turning point. It shattered the earlier narrative that the war was limited and distant from ordinary Russian life. Mobilization triggered protests, mass emigration, and widespread anxiety. Training and equipment for new recruits were often inadequate, leading to further losses and criticism even within pro-war circles. The mobilization also highlighted structural weaknesses in Russia's military system. Corruption, poor logistics, and rigid command structures hindered effectiveness. While Russia still possessed significant resources, the war exposed limits to its ability to convert those resources into sustained battlefield success. The image of Russia as a peer military superpower to the United States was increasingly questioned by analysts around the world. At the same time, Russia doubled down on its strategic messaging. The war was portrayed as existential, a struggle against Western encirclement and cultural erosion. This framing helped justify sacrifices at home and appealed to nationalist sentiment. By linking the conflict to Russia's historical memory, especially the trauma of World War II, the Kremlin sought to transform the war into a test of national survival. Internationally, the conflict continued to reshape alliances. NATO expanded, with historically neutral countries seeking membership, driven by fear of Russian aggression. Defense budgets rose across Europe. Military planning shifted from expeditionary missions to territorial defense. The war revived discussions about deterrence, nuclear risk, and the role of conventional forces in an era thought to be moving beyond large-scale land warfare. Beyond Europe, reactions were more complex. Many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America avoided taking sides, emphasizing neutrality or non-alignment. For them, the war was less about abstract principles and more about economic consequences, energy prices, food security, and diplomatic flexibility. Russia sought to exploit this ambivalence, strengthening ties with China, Iran, and other states willing to challenge Western dominance or benefit from discounted resources. China's role, in particular, drew intense scrutiny. While avoiding direct military support, Beijing provided diplomatic backing and economic engagement that helped cushion Russia against isolation. The war thus intersected with broader U.S.-China rivalry, raising concerns that Ukraine could become a precedent for future conflicts over Taiwan or other contested regions. As the conflict dragged on, discussions about negotiation resurfaced periodically, often after major offensives or setbacks. Yet each attempt faced the same obstacle: incompatible goals. Ukraine insisted on restoring its territorial integrity, including Crimea. Russia demanded recognition of its annexations and security guarantees. Public opinion in both countries hardened, making compromise politically risky. The longer the war lasted, the more it entrenched maximalist positions. What became increasingly evident was that the Russia-Ukraine war was not just a military contest, but a transformative event for the global system. It challenged assumptions about deterrence, exposed vulnerabilities in global supply chains, and forced states to rethink energy dependence and defense readiness. It demonstrated that large-scale war between states was not a relic of the past, but a present and ongoing reality. By this stage, the central question was no longer how the war began, but how it might end, and at what cost. Every additional month of fighting deepened destruction, hardened identities, and narrowed the space for reconciliation. Whatever the eventual outcome, the war had already reshaped Ukraine, Russia, and the world in ways that would endure long after the guns fell silent. As the war dragged deeper into its second and third years, a sense of strategic exhaustion began to settle over the battlefield, but not in the way many outsiders had predicted. Neither side collapsed, neither side broke. Instead, the conflict settled into a brutal equilibrium where progress was measured in meters, not kilometers, and victories were often temporary, costly, and psychologically draining. This phase revealed the true nature of modern industrial war when both sides are determined to endure. Ukraine increasingly framed the conflict as a war of liberation and survival. The narrative was no longer just about defending borders, but about reclaiming identity, history, and sovereignty. Every occupied town carried stories of repression, forced deportations, and cultural erasure. These accounts hardened Ukrainian resolve and justified continued resistance despite immense suffering. The war became personal for millions, not just ideological. Military strategy evolved accordingly. Ukraine emphasized combined arms operations, attempting to integrate infantry, armor, artillery, drones, and intelligence into coordinated offensives. Western training played a role here, but adaptation was uneven. Limited air power, dense minefields, and layered Russian defenses made breakthroughs extraordinarily difficult. Each offensive faced the same dilemma: push forward and suffer heavy losses, or pause and risk losing momentum and international attention. Russia, meanwhile, leaned even further into defensive warfare. Massive trench networks, dragon's teeth obstacles, and layered artillery zones transformed occupied territory into fortified belts. The objective was no longer rapid conquest, but exhaustion. Russian commanders calculated that Ukraine's manpower, economy, and political unity would eventually crack under prolonged pressure. Time, in this view, became a weapon. The air war also took on new dimensions. While neither side achieved air superiority, missile and drone strikes expanded in scale and intensity. Russia increasingly targeted Ukrainian energy infrastructure, particularly during winter months. The goal was clear: make daily life unbearable, sap morale, and strengthen the government's capacity to provide basic services. Ukraine responded by dispersing power generation, repairing infrastructure under fire, and strengthening air defenses with Western systems. These strikes blurred the line between battlefield and home front. Civilians became central targets not because of tactical necessity, but because of strategic calculation. This raised profound ethical and legal questions, but it also highlighted a reality of modern warfare. Wars are fought as much against societies as against armies. Ukraine's resilience in this context became one of the war's defining features. Inside Russia, the long war quietly reshaped society. While state control over media limited open dissent, the cumulative effects of casualties, economic strain, and isolation were impossible to fully conceal. Families felt the absence of sons and fathers. Regional inequalities became more visible as poorer areas supplied disproportionate numbers of soldiers. The promise of quick victory faded, replaced by a narrative of sacrifice and endurance. The Russian economy adapted unevenly. Sanctions failed to cause immediate collapse, but they imposed long-term constraints. Access to advanced technology narrowed, energy revenues fluctuated. The state redirected resources toward the military-industrial complex, reviving factories and supply chains geared toward war production. This shift stabilized short-term capacity, but came at the expense of broader economic development. International support for Ukraine also entered a more complex phase. Early unity began to fray under political pressures, election cycles, and economic fatigue. Debates emerged within Western societies about costs, priorities, and risks of escalation. Yet support did not disappear. Instead, it became more conditional, more transactional, and more openly debated. Ukraine had to continuously justify not just its cause, but its strategy. This dynamic placed Kyiv in a difficult position. Any military setback risked eroding confidence abroad, while any escalation risked provoking fears of wider war. Ukraine's leadership walked a narrow path, balancing battlefield needs with diplomatic signaling. Every decision carried consequences far beyond the front lines. Meanwhile, the war's global ripple effects deepened. Energy markets adjusted, accelerating Europe's shift away from Russian gas. Defense spending surged worldwide. Countries reassessed supply chains, food security, and strategic autonomy. The conflict became a case study for militaries studying drone warfare, electronic countermeasures, and decentralized command structures. Lessons were being written in real time, paid for in blood. The nuclear dimension loomed constantly in the background. Russia's repeated references to its nuclear arsenal were not random. They served as deterrent signals, designed to limit Western involvement without crossing explicit red lines. Ukraine and its allies learned to operate under this shadow, calibrating actions to avoid triggering catastrophic escalation while still applying pressure. The war demonstrated how nuclear weapons shape conventional conflicts even when they are never used. Diplomatic efforts continued intermittently, often quietly and without fanfare. Back-channel talks, humanitarian negotiations, prisoner exchanges, all suggested that communication never fully ceased. Yet a comprehensive peace remained elusive. The core issue persisted: territory, security, and legitimacy. For Ukraine, any settlement that rewarded aggression felt unacceptable. For Russia, withdrawal without guarantees threatened regime credibility and strategic depth. As months turned into years, the war's psychological toll deepened. Trauma spread across generations. Children grew up with air raid sirens as background noise. Soldiers cycled between front lines and brief respites, carrying unseen scars. The conflict reshaped national consciousness in both countries, forging identities around endurance, grievance, and memory. What this stage of the war made unmistakably clear was that there would be no clean ending. No single battle would decide everything. No dramatic surrender would close the chapter. The war had become a long struggle over narratives as much as territory, over the future shape of Europe, and over the rules that govern power in the international system. By now, the question facing the world was not whether the war mattered, it unquestionably did, but whether its outcome would reinforce or dismantle the fragile norms that had restrained great power conflict since the end of the Cold War. And as the fighting continued, that answer remained painfully uncertain. As the war moved deeper into uncertainty, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever the final battlefield outcome, the Russia-Ukraine war had already crossed the point of no return in shaping the future of global politics. The conflict was no longer just about Ukraine's borders or Russia's ambitions. It had become a defining struggle over how power is exercised, challenged, and resisted in the 21st century. For Ukraine, the war fundamentally transformed the state itself. Institutions hardened under pressure. Corruption, once a persistent weakness, became politically toxic as survival demanded efficiency and trust. Civil society grew stronger, more organized, and deeply invested in the idea of a sovereign future aligned with Europe. The war forged a national identity that had been forming for decades, but was now sealed fueled by sacrifice. Ukraine emerged not as a passive victim of geopolitics, but as an active agent reshaping its destiny through resistance. At the same time, the costs were immense. Entire regions lay scarred. Demographic damage would echo for generations. Millions remained displaced, unsure if they would ever return home. Even in victory, Ukraine would face the challenge of reconstruction, reconciliation, and redefining its relationship with neighbors who had once seemed distant but now shaped every strategic calculation. The war ensured that Ukraine's future would be permanently linked to European security, whether through formal alliances or irreversible political alignment. For Russia, the war exposed contradictions at the heart of its power. Militarily, it demonstrated that size and legacy alone no longer guarantee dominance. The assumption that fear, speed, and overwhelming force could substitute for legitimacy and adaptability proved flawed. Strategically, the war undermined Russia's stated goal of preventing NATO expansion, as new members joined and others strengthened their defenses. Politically, it tied the country's trajectory to prolonged confrontation with the West. Internally, Russia entered a period of quiet transformation. The state tightened control, reshaped education, media, and historical narratives around the war, and normalized militarization in daily life. Yet beneath this surface, pressures accumulated. Economic isolation narrowed options. Technological dependence became more visible. Younger generations faced a future defined less by opportunity and more by obligation. Whether this produced long-term stability or eventual fracture remained an open question. Globally, the war accelerated shifts that were already underway. The idea of a rules-based international order, often criticized as selective or fragile, was tested openly. For some states, Ukraine's resistance reaffirmed the value of sovereignty and deterrence. For others, the conflict reinforced skepticism, highlighting how power still shapes outcomes despite legal norms. The world did not divide neatly into moral camps, but into overlapping interests, anxieties, and calculations. Energy politics changed dramatically. Europe's rapid move away from Russian gas reconfigured markets and alliances. Defense industries expanded. Military planning refocused on large-scale conflict rather than counter-terrorism or peacekeeping. The war revived concepts once thought outdated: trenches, mass mobilization, territorial defense. It forced militaries to rethink assumptions about technology, morale, and the balance between precision and quantity. Perhaps most significantly, the conflict redefined how wars are perceived and experienced. Social media, open-source intelligence, and real-time footage collapsed the distance between front lines and living rooms. Narratives competed as fiercely as armies. Public opinion became a strategic factor, shaping aid decisions and political will. The war was fought simultaneously in trenches, parliaments, data centers, and digital platforms. The nuclear shadow never fully receded. Russia's signaling reminded the world that nuclear-armed states operate under different rules, even when they fail conventionally. This reality complicated responses, constrained escalation, and raised uncomfortable questions about deterrence credibility. Other powers watched closely, drawing lessons that could influence future crises far beyond Eastern Europe. As talk of eventual ceasefires and frozen conflicts emerged, history offered sobering parallels. Conflicts that end without resolution often plant the seeds of future wars. Borders left ambiguous, grievances left unaddressed, and security dilemmas left unresolved tend to resurface with greater force. Any pause in fighting, if it came, would likely be fragile, contested, and politically charged. Yet even in this bleak landscape, the war revealed something else: the enduring capacity of societies to resist domination. Ukraine's defense challenged assumptions of inevitability and power asymmetry. It demonstrated that cohesion, legitimacy, and purpose can offset material disadvantage. This lesson resonated globally, particularly among smaller states navigating a world of great power rivalry. As the war settled into prolonged intensity, it became clear that battles were not just measured in territory, but in morale, endurance, and the ability to adapt faster than the opponent. Key engagements illustrated the brutal arithmetic of modern conflict. The fight for cities like Bakhmut and Mariupol demonstrated how strategic value could be eclipsed by symbolic weight. Each inch of territory cost thousands of lives, with urban warfare reducing neighborhoods to rubble and turning civilian infrastructure into instruments of siege. Russian tactics relied on heavy bombardment and attrition, hoping sheer firepower could break Ukrainian defenses. Ukraine, however, leaned on mobility, precision strikes, and deep knowledge of terrain, turning narrow streets, factories, and basements into deadly choke points. In this contrast, the war revealed a fundamental truth: advanced technology and numerical superiority could be neutralized by ingenuity, resilience, and local support. Beyond the front lines, the conflict reshaped Europe's strategic calculus. NATO, revitalized in the wake of the invasion, expanded coordination, deployed forces to eastern member states, and accelerated military modernization. Formerly neutral countries like Sweden and Finland moved to join the alliance, signaling that Russia's actions had unintended consequences. Its aggression hardened opposition and expanded the very military bloc it sought to counter. The war also forced Europe to rethink energy independence. Reliance on Russian gas, once seen as a tool for stability and leverage, became a vulnerability. European countries scrambled to diversify supplies, invest in renewables, and withstand winter energy crises, demonstrating how military conflict can ripple through economies and societies far from the battlefield. Economic ramifications extended globally. Ukraine, known as the breadbasket of Europe, saw its agricultural output disrupted. Grain exports slowed or stopped, creating cascading effects in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Russia, cut off from Western markets and investment, experienced a technological slowdown and long-term isolation in key sectors. Inflation and commodity price shocks rippled worldwide, showing how a regional war could reverberate through a highly interconnected global economy. Beyond trade, the conflict also highlighted vulnerabilities in logistics, supply chains, and international financial systems, forcing nations to rethink risk in a world where war in one region could have immediate consequences everywhere. Humanitarian crises deepened. Millions of Ukrainians were displaced internally or became refugees, creating enormous pressure on neighboring countries. Hospitals, schools, and civilian infrastructure were repeatedly targeted, either intentionally or as collateral damage. International aid flowed, but the scale of destruction outpaced resources. Beyond the immediate suffering, the war threatened to scar an entire generation of children, shaping education, health, and social cohesion for decades. Communities that survived the front line now faced rebuilding in a landscape littered with unexploded ordnance and psychological trauma, highlighting that modern war's impact extends far beyond military calculations. Diplomatically, the war created new alignments and tensions. Western countries were united in sanctions and support for Ukraine, but subtle fractures emerged over strategy, timelines, and levels of engagement. Neutral or non-aligned countries sought to mediate or extract advantages, navigating the conflict with caution. China and other powers observed closely, weighing the lessons for their regional ambitions, particularly regarding Taiwan. The conflict illustrated that wars today are not isolated. They intersect with global competition, technological rivalry, and the recalibration of alliances in real time. Strategically, the Russia-Ukraine war challenged assumptions about military power in the modern era. It demonstrated that hybrid approaches, blending conventional force, cyber operations, drone warfare, information campaigns, and economic leverage could produce unpredictable outcomes. Russia's inability to achieve rapid victory contradicted pre-war expectations, while Ukraine's defense highlighted the potency of asymmetric tactics and external support. Lessons for military planners worldwide became clear. Modern wars are multi-domain, protracted, and shaped by factors beyond sheer numbers or technology. On the question of legitimacy, the war raised profound issues. Russia's claims of defending Russian-speaking populations and securing strategic depth were widely rejected internationally, while Ukraine's defense was framed as a fight for sovereignty and the right to self-determination. This narrative battle influenced sanctions, international law discourse, and global opinion, reinforcing that modern conflicts are fought on both material and symbolic fronts. Morality, perception, and narrative became inseparable from strategy, shaping support, funding, and future alliances. The long-term historical significance of the conflict is still unfolding. Ukraine may emerge territorially intact, partially restored, or frozen into a prolonged stalemate, but the war has already shifted European security architecture. Russia's international isolation will continue to shape its economy, military doctrine, and foreign policy. The West has seen the limits and strengths of coalition building, the vulnerabilities of energy dependence, and the consequences of underestimating regional resistance. The war will be studied for decades as a case of modern state-on-state conflict, hybrid warfare, and the limits of preemptive aggression. The human dimension remains perhaps the most poignant legacy. Soldiers, civilians, and refugees alike have endured trauma, displacement, and loss. Societies on both sides of the conflict will carry these scars for generations. For Ukraine, the struggle has cemented a shared identity rooted in resistance and sovereignty. For Russia, the consequences, economic, demographic, and psychological, will shape policy, society, and political discourse for years to come. War, in this sense, is measured not only in land gained or lost, but in the transformation of the people who live through it. Ultimately, the Russia-Ukraine war teaches enduring lessons about the unpredictability of conflict, the limits of power, and the resilience of human societies. Initial assumptions, quick victory, limited resistance, or the collapse of morale were shattered. The war proved that determination, strategy, and international support can offset apparent material superiority. At the same time, it revealed that even the strongest nations are constrained by logistics, morale, and global consequences. No single actor controls the outcome entirely. As this conflict continues to unfold, it remains a mirror reflecting the complexities of the modern world, the interplay of history, identity, strategy, and global interconnectedness. Its resolution will define not just the future of Ukraine and Russia, but the broader rules of international order, the credibility of alliances, and the calculations of leaders everywhere. The war is a reminder that in a world of unprecedented connectivity, no conflict is purely local, and every decision has reverberations far beyond the battlefield. And so, after years of fighting, suffering, and resilience, one question remains central. Can diplomacy, endurance, and international law finally bring peace, or are we witnessing the beginning of a longer era of confrontation that will reshape Europe and the world for decades to come? In the end, the Russia-Ukraine war stands as a reminder that history does not move in straight lines. It is shaped by choices, miscalculations, fears, and moments when leaders act believing force can resolve what politics cannot. This war began with an expectation of speed and control. It evolved into a prolonged struggle whose consequences escaped all original plans. Long after the battle's end, the questions raised by this conflict will remain. How far can power go before resistance hardens into permanence? Can security be built through consent or only through consensus? And in a world where war has returned to Europe on this scale, will future leaders learn restraint from this tragedy or repeat its mistakes? Do you think this war was inevitable, or could history have taken a different path?